Picture yourself settling into the gentle embrace of history tonight, where the mists of the Colombian Andes carry whispers of old stories, and the cobblestone streets of colonial towns echo with footsteps that may or may not belong to the living. Tonight, we journey into a world where superstition and daily life intertwined like morning fog through mountain valleys, where the line between reality and legend blurred in the flickering light of oil lamps and the shadows cast by wide-brimmed hats. In the highlands of Colombia, in the valleys of Venezuela, and throughout the Andean regions where Spanish colonial influence mixed with indigenous beliefs, there lived a fear that walked on two legs, wore fine clothes, and played haunting melodies on a guitar. This was El Sombrerón, the man in the large hat, a figure who embodied the deepest anxieties of communities caught between old worlds and new, between the familiar rhythms of rural life and the unsettling changes brought by colonial rule. Tonight, you'll discover what it truly meant to live in a world where every shadow might conceal a supernatural threat, where mothers braided their daughters' hair not just for beauty but for protection, and where the sound of guitar strings in the distance could signal either romance or something far more sinister. Let the gentle cadence of these stories carry you back to an era where fear was as much a part of daily life as the rising sun, and where the supernatural felt as real and immediate as the mountain air itself. Allow yourself to drift into this world of whispered warnings and protective rituals, where we'll explore not just the legend of El Sombrerón, but the very human experiences of those who believed in him, feared him, and shaped their lives around the possibility of his presence. Close your eyes, and let us begin this journey through the mist-shrouded paths of Colombian folklore. What it was really like to fear El Sombrerón. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a small mountain town of 18th century Colombia, where the air carries the crisp bite of altitude and the lingering scent of wood smoke from dying hearth fires. The cobblestones beneath your feet are still damp with dew as you step outside your modest adobe home, and in that hushed moment between night and morning, you pause to listen. Every resident of these highland communities learned this habit early, the art of listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. The fear of El Sombrerón was not an abstract terror relegated to campfire stories. It was a living, breathing part of daily existence, woven into the fabric of routine as surely as the woolen ponchos worn against the mountain chill. This fear shaped the rhythm of entire communities, dictating when doors were locked, when children were called inside, and when even the bravest adults chose to remain within the safety of their homes. In these mountain towns, where Spanish colonial architecture cast long shadows down narrow streets, the presence of El Sombrerón was felt most keenly in the spaces between certainty and doubt. He was said to be a figure of contradiction, impeccably dressed in the finest clothes, wearing a hat so large it cast his face in perpetual shadow, yet somehow managing to move through the world with an otherworldly silence that defied the natural order of things. The townspeople described him in hushed tones, always careful not to speak too loudly, as if the very act of naming him might summon his attention. They spoke of a man who appeared to be wealthy, perhaps a landowner or merchant, dressed in a black suit with silver buttons that caught what little light filtered through the mountain mist. His boots, they said, were of the finest leather, polished to such a shine that they seemed to reflect not the world around him, but something else entirely, perhaps glimpses of the realm from which he came. But it was the hat that gave him his name and defined his presence in the collective imagination of these communities. Described as impossibly wide-brimmed, casting a shadow so deep that no one could clearly see his face, the hat seemed to exist as much as a supernatural barrier as a piece of clothing. Those who claimed to have encountered El Sombrerón spoke not of facial features or expressions, but of the overwhelming sense of being watched by something hidden beneath that enormous brim. The fear was most acute during the hours of twilight and early evening, when the day's work was done but full darkness had not yet settled over the mountains. This was the time when families hurried to complete their final tasks, bringing livestock into enclosed yards, securing shutters against windows, and ensuring that all members of the household were accounted for and safely inside. The transition from day to night, always a vulnerable time in rural communities, became especially fraught with anxiety in places where El Sombrerón was believed to roam. Women, particularly young women, bore the heaviest burden of this fear. The legend held that El Sombrerón was drawn to feminine beauty, especially to women with long, dark hair that he could braid while they slept. This aspect of the mythology transformed even the most mundane aspects of personal grooming into acts laden with supernatural significance. The simple act of braiding one's hair before bed became a protective ritual, performed with the understanding that loose hair flowing freely might invite unwanted attention from the shadowy figure. Mothers passed down elaborate protocols for their daughters, specific ways to braid hair, particular prayers to recite, and detailed instructions about sleeping positions that might offer protection. The bedroom itself became a carefully arranged sanctuary, with mirrors positioned to reflect any intruder, religious icons placed strategically around the room, and sometimes even salt scattered across windowsills as an additional barrier against supernatural intrusion. The fear extended beyond individual households to encompass entire social structures. Young women rarely ventured out alone after sunset, and even during daylight hours, they traveled in groups when possible. Courtship rituals, traditionally conducted in the evening hours when work was finished, became elaborate negotiations between romantic desire and supernatural terror. Young men found themselves competing not only with other suitors, but with the ever-present possibility that their beloved might fall victim to El Sombrerán's influence. This was a fear that permeated every aspect of community life, from the practical arrangements of daily routines to the deeper psychological landscape of what it meant to live in a world where the supernatural felt immediate and present. The terror was not abstract or distant, it was as real as the mountain mist that rolled through the valleys each evening, as tangible as the sound of one's own heartbeat echoing in the silence of a too-quiet night. In these communities, every unexplained sound, every shadow that seemed to move independently of its source, every moment of unaccounted time became potential evidence of El Sombrerán's presence. The line between rational explanation and supernatural causation blurred until residents found themselves living in a state of constant, low-level vigilance that colored every aspect of their existence. Late-night walks and lanterns in the fog. The streets of colonial mountain towns took on an entirely different character once darkness fell and the mist began its nightly descent from the peaks above. If you had been walking these cobblestone paths in the hours after sunset, you would have noticed how quickly the familiar daytime landscape transformed into something alien and potentially threatening. The comfortable rhythms of community life, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, the steady clip-clop of mule hooves on stone, gave way to a hushed, almost cathedral-like silence broken only by the distant sound of your own footsteps echoing off the adobe walls. Those who had legitimate reasons to venture out after dark, midwives summoned to births, priests called to deathbeds, or watchmen making their rounds, moved through these streets with a heightened awareness that went beyond mere caution. They carried lanterns not just for illumination, but as talismans against the unknown. The warm circle of light cast by an oil flame became a portable sanctuary, a moving bubble of the known world that pushed back against the encroaching realm of shadow and possibility. The fog that descended from the mountains each evening seemed to possess an almost sentient quality, rolling down the narrow valleys and settling into the streets with a weight that muffled sound and obscured familiar landmarks. In this transformed landscape, distance became difficult to judge, and the simple act of navigation required a level of concentration that left little mental energy for other concerns, except, inevitably, for the persistent awareness of what might be lurking just beyond the reach of one's lantern light. Those who found themselves abroad during these evening hours developed their own personal rituals and superstitions. Some walked with a deliberate, steady pace, believing that any deviation from normal human movement might attract unwanted attention. Others varied their routes unpredictably, thinking that established patterns might make them easier targets for supernatural predation. Still others carried small bells or made soft sounds as they walked, reasoning that El Sombrerán's supernatural silence could be countered by maintaining an audible human presence. The lanterns themselves became objects of both practical necessity and symbolic significance. The better families used whale oil or imported candles that burned with a clean, steady flame, while those of more modest means made do with tallow or animal fat that produced a smokier, less reliable light. But regardless of the fuel source, the lantern represented more than mere illumination. It was a declaration of human presence in a world that seemed to grow less human with each passing hour of darkness. Walking at night meant navigating not just the physical obstacles of uneven cobblestones and narrow alleys, but also the psychological landscape of accumulated community fears. Every doorway could conceal a watching presence, every alley mouth might hide something that shouldn't be there, and every distant sound, the creak of a shutter, the rustle of leaves, the faint echo of what might be music, required careful evaluation to determine whether it posed a threat. The fog played tricks with both sight and sound, creating acoustic effects that could make footsteps seem to approach from multiple directions simultaneously, or cause one's own breathing to echo back as if someone else were standing just outside the reach of the lantern's glow. In this environment, even the most rational individuals found their minds creating explanations that ventured into supernatural territory. A shadow that moved independently of its source, footsteps that seemed to match one's own pace too perfectly, or the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes became common experiences that were difficult to dismiss as mere imagination. Those who made these night journeys regularly, the town's watchman, the local priest, or the occasional merchant traveling between communities, developed their own informal networks of mutual support. They would note each other's lanterns from a distance, call out greetings across the fog-shrouded streets, and maintain a loose but vigilant awareness of who else was moving through the darkness. This created a fragile web of human connection that helped counter the isolating effects of the supernatural fear that seemed to intensify with the setting sun. The experience of walking through these mountain towns at night, surrounded by fog and carrying only a small circle of light, produced a unique form of consciousness, simultaneously hyper-alert and strangely meditative. The mind, deprived of the usual visual references and social interactions of daytime, often turned inward, creating a state of awareness that was particularly susceptible to suggestion and the influence of deeply held beliefs about what might be lurking in the darkness. The echoes of hooves and whispers in the trees. In the acoustic landscape of colonial mountain communities, certain sounds carried meanings that went far beyond their immediate physical causes. The clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestones, ordinarily the most mundane of daily sounds, could become laden with ominous significance when heard at unusual hours or in unexpected patterns. The residents of these highland towns developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the subtleties of sound, learning to distinguish between the familiar footfalls of neighbors' horses and the potentially threatening approach of something that might not be entirely of this world. El Sombrerón, according to the accumulated testimony of generations of believers, often announced his presence through sound rather than sight. Witnesses spoke of hearing the steady rhythm of horse hooves approaching their homes during the deepest hours of night, only to find nothing when they gathered the courage to peer through shuttered windows. The sound would begin at a distance, growing gradually closer with an inevitable, mechanical precision that seemed to mock the organic irregularities of normal travel. These phantom hoofbeats possessed certain characteristics that distinguished them from ordinary traffic. They maintained a perfect, metronomic rhythm that never varied for obstacles, never paused for rest, and never deviated from their mysterious path. More unsettling still, the sound seemed to approach from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an acoustic impossibility that left listeners questioning not just what they were hearing, but the reliability of their own senses. The whispers in the trees presented an even more disturbing auditory phenomenon. The mountain regions where El Sombrerón was said to roam were characterized by dense groves of eucalyptus and native trees that created natural amphitheaters where sound could carry and echo in unexpected ways. During certain weather conditions, particularly when the wind moved through these groves at specific angles, the rustling of leaves could create sounds that bore an uncanny resemblance to human conversation conducted at the very edge of hearing. Those who lived near these wooded areas reported experiences that followed remarkably consistent patterns. They would become aware of what seemed to be voices engaged in quiet discussion somewhere among the trees, conversation that was just indistinct enough to prevent understanding of actual words, but clear enough to suggest the cadences and inflections of human speech. The phenomenon was most commonly reported during transition periods, just after sunset, before dawn, or during the changing of seasons when atmospheric conditions might create unusual acoustic effects. The psychological impact of these auditory experiences cannot be overstated. Unlike visual hallucinations, which might be dismissed as tricks of light or shadow, sounds possessed an immediacy and physicality that made them difficult to rationalize away. The human ear, evolved to detect potential threats through subtle audio cues, responded to these ambiguous sounds with alarm responses that were both automatic and difficult to suppress. Families living in houses positioned near wooded areas developed their own coping strategies for dealing with these unsettling auditory environments. Some chose to mask the sounds by maintaining low levels of conversation or activity throughout the evening hours, reasoning that their own human sounds would overwhelm any supernatural communications that might be occurring nearby. Others adopted the opposite approach, maintaining absolute silence so that they could monitor their acoustic environment for any changes that might signal the approach of danger. The trees themselves seemed to participate in the supernatural ecosystem that surrounded El Sombrerón legend. Certain groves acquired reputations as places where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds grew thin. These locations were often characterized by unusual acoustic properties, areas where voices carried further than physics would suggest, where echoes returned with subtle alterations that made them seem like responses from invisible conversationalists, or where the normal sounds of wind and rustling leaves occasionally organized themselves into patterns that resembled music or speech. Children growing up in these communities learned to navigate the acoustic landscape with the same careful attention their parents devoted to visual hazards. They were taught to distinguish between the sounds that required investigation and those that were best ignored, to recognize the difference between natural phenomena and potential supernatural activity, and to understand that certain combinations of sound and circumstance might signal the need for immediate retreat to the safety of home and family. The whispers and hoofbeats became part of the shared cultural vocabulary of these mountain communities, providing a language through which residents could communicate their fears and experiences without having to confront them directly. A simple comment about hearing things in the trees last night could convey volumes of information about one's state of mind, level of concern, and need for community support, all while maintaining the social fiction that these experiences fell within the range of normal, explicable phenomena. Living with superstition. Daily rituals for safety. The fear of El Sombrerón created an elaborate framework of protective practices that govern nearly every aspect of daily life in the mountain communities where his legend flourished. These rituals and precautions were not viewed as superstitions by the people who practiced them, but rather as practical necessities, as essential to survival as securing livestock against predators or storing grain against the possibility of poor harvests. The morning routine in a household conscious of El Sombrerán's threat began before dawn with a systematic inventory of the night's potential intrusions. Mothers would check their daughters' hair for any signs of unauthorized braiding, examining each strand for evidence of supernatural tampering. The absence of such signs was cause for relief, but never for the abandonment of vigilance. Each new day required its own complete set of protective measures, as if the safety of the previous night provided no guarantee for the night to come. The preparation of meals took on additional significance in households where El Sombrerón was feared. Certain foods were believed to offer protection against supernatural influence: garlic braided into decorative strings and hung in doorways, specific herbs grown in carefully tended gardens and incorporated into daily cooking, and salt scattered across thresholds and window sills according to patterns passed down through generations of women who had successfully protected their families from otherworldly threats. The arrangement of domestic space reflected these protective priorities. Mirrors were positioned not merely for personal grooming, but as supernatural security devices, placed at angles calculated to reflect any intruder while avoiding configurations that might accidentally create portals for unwanted visitors. Religious imagery, crosses, saints' medallions, and blessed candles formed protective networks throughout the home, with particular attention paid to entrances, sleeping areas, and spaces where young women spent significant amounts of time. The daily grooming of hair became an elaborate ritual laden with protective significance. Young women learned complex braiding patterns that were believed to discourage supernatural attention, techniques passed down from mother to daughter along with the specific prayers and invocations that should accompany each step of the process. The tools used for this daily ritual, combs, ribbons, and pins, were often blessed by local priests or treated with protective substances that enhanced their ability to serve as barriers against otherworldly influence. Evening preparations required the most extensive precautions. As sunset approached, households would begin a systematic process of supernatural fortification that could take hours to complete properly. Windows were not merely closed but secured with specific types of latches and protected by arrangements of blessed objects. Doors were locked with iron keys and further secured by patterns of salt or blessed water applied to thresholds. Even the arrangement of furniture within rooms followed protective principles, with beds positioned to avoid direct alignment with doors or windows, and chairs arranged to create clear sight lines that would reveal any unauthorized presence. The social aspects of daily life were equally influenced by protective considerations. Young women rarely ventured out alone, particularly during transition periods when supernatural activity was believed to be most likely. When social gatherings occurred, they were carefully structured to provide maximum protection for vulnerable individuals. Young women were seated in the center of groups, away from windows and doors, and social activities were concluded well before the hours when El Sombrerón was most active. Religious observances took on heightened importance in communities where supernatural threats were felt to be immediate and present. Daily prayers were not merely expressions of faith, but active protective measures designed to maintain spiritual barriers against otherworldly intrusion. Special novenas and devotional practices were observed during periods when supernatural activity was believed to increase, certain phases of the moon, particular seasons, or times of community stress when the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds might become more permeable. The protective rituals extended beyond individual households to encompass entire communities. Neighborhood watch systems developed organically, with residents maintaining informal but vigilant awareness of unusual activities in their vicinity. The positioning of houses, the design of public spaces, and even the scheduling of community events reflected collective strategies for minimizing supernatural risk while maintaining the social connections essential for community survival. These daily practices created a rhythm of life that was simultaneously restrictive and comforting. While the constant vigilance required by El Sombrerons perceived threat limited freedom and spontaneity, it also provided a sense of agency in the face of cosmic uncertainty. By faithfully observing protective rituals, community members could feel that they were actively participating in their own defense rather than remaining helplessly vulnerable to forces beyond their control or understanding. When the dogs bark at nothing. In the mountain communities where El Sombrerón was feared, domestic animals served as an early warning system for supernatural activity, their behavior monitored with the same careful attention that modern residents might pay to smoke detectors or security alarms. Dogs, in particular, were believed to possess sensory capabilities that allowed them to detect otherworldly presences long before such entities became apparent to human perception. The phenomenon of dogs barking at apparently empty air became one of the most reliable indicators that El Sombrerón might be in the vicinity. These episodes followed patterns that distinguished them from ordinary canine behavior. The barking would begin suddenly, without any apparent trigger, and would be directed towards specific locations or directions rather than expressing generalized distress. The dogs would often position themselves between their human families and whatever invisible presence had captured their attention, displaying protective behaviors that suggested they were responding to a genuine threat rather than mere neurosis or boredom. Experienced dog owners in these communities learned to read the subtle distinctions in their animals' warning behaviors. The bark that announced El Sombrerons' presence was described as different from the sounds dogs made when alerting to human intruders, wild animals, or other familiar threats. It possessed a quality of desperate urgency mixed with profound unease, as if the animal was struggling to communicate a danger for which it had no adequate vocabulary. The timing of these episodes provided additional confirmation of their supernatural nature. Dogs would typically begin their warnings during the evening hours, often well before human observers became aware of any unusual activity. The barking would intensify as night deepened, reaching peaks of intensity that corresponded to times when El Sombrerón was believed to be most active. By dawn, the animals would have returned to their normal behavior, though often appearing exhausted and emotionally drained from their night-long vigil. Other domestic animals exhibited their own forms of supernatural sensitivity. Horses would refuse to travel certain routes or pass particular locations, despite having navigated these same paths without difficulty during daylight hours. Chickens would cease laying eggs or would produce eggs with unusual characteristics, shells too thin or too thick, yolks of unusual colors, or shapes that deviated from normal poultry production. Cows would produce less milk or milk that failed to curdle properly for cheese making. Economic losses that added material consequences to the psychological stress of supernatural threat. The behavior of these animals created a complex information network that extended throughout the community. Residents learned to monitor not only their own animals but also the behavior of their neighbors' livestock. A chorus of barking dogs spreading from house to house could indicate the movement of supernatural presence through the community, allowing residents to track potential threats and adjust their own protective measures accordingly. The interpretation of animal behavior required considerable skill and experience. Not every instance of unusual animal behavior indicated supernatural activity. Illness, changes in weather, or the presence of ordinary predators could produce similar effects. Community members developed sophisticated systems for distinguishing between natural and supernatural causes, taking into account factors such as the time of occurrence, the specific behaviors displayed, the number of animals affected, and correlation with other potential indicators of otherworldly activity. Children growing up in these communities learn to pay careful attention to animal behavior patterns as part of their basic education in supernatural self-defense. They were taught to recognize the signs that indicated genuine supernatural threat versus ordinary animal distress, to understand how different species might react to otherworldly presences, and to appreciate the role that domestic animals played in maintaining community security against threats that human senses might miss entirely. The dogs that proved most sensitive to El Sombrerán's presence often became community resources, their owners accepting informal responsibilities for monitoring supernatural activity in their neighborhoods. These animals were fed and cared for not merely as pets or working animals, but as essential components of the community's defense infrastructure. Their health and well-being became matters of public concern, and their behavior was discussed and analyzed with the seriousness typically reserved for matters of life and death. The psychological comfort provided by these animal early warning systems cannot be overstated. In a world where supernatural threat felt immediate and constant, the knowledge that loyal animals were standing guard against dangers beyond human perception offered a measure of security that allowed community members to sleep more peacefully and go about their daily routines with greater confidence. The animals became intermediaries between the human world and whatever realm El Sombrerón inhabited, faithful guardians whose vigilance helped maintain the fragile boundaries between the known and the unknowable. The legend's origins, colonial cruelty and myth. To understand the legend of El Sombrerón, we must first step back into the earliest days of Spanish colonization in the highlands of South America. Imagine, if you will, a time when vast, cloud-crowned mountains watched silently as foreign flags were planted in lands that had long known other gods, other stories, and other ways of life. The collision between European and indigenous cultures was not simply a meeting, it was a fracture. And from that rupture, new stories emerged. Some were hopeful, others bitter. And a few, like the tale of El Sombrerón, were cloaked in fear. The origins of El Sombrerón are layered, like sediment in the mountains where he is said to wander. His story is not that of a single man, but rather a shadow cast by centuries of domination, cruelty, and misunderstanding. In the earliest tellings, whispered in towns nestled deep within the Andes, he was not a ghost, nor a devil, but a man, real, wealthy, and terrifying. A landowner, perhaps. Or a wandering colonial enforcer. Someone with power that came not from respect but from unchecked authority. This man, they say, moved from town to town on horseback, his wide-brimmed hat shielding his face from both sun and scrutiny. He was known to take what he wanted: land, labor, and at times, the affections of indigenous women. Often these women had little say in the matter. His presence inspired silence, fear, and resentment. He may have dressed impeccably and spoken with a polished accent, but to those who watched from behind barred windows, he was not a gentleman. He was a threat. Over time, stories of this figure changed. As colonial rule continued, and as generations passed, the brutalities of conquest were often too painful, or too dangerous, to speak of directly. So they transformed into legend, into metaphor. And thus, El Sombrerón ceased to be merely a man and became something more, and less. A specter of power abused. A cautionary tale woven into the fabric of mountain life. Some scholars suggest that El Sombrerón was a hybrid figure, born from indigenous fears of Spanish dominance and Catholic teachings about sin and temptation. Others believe he was shaped by centuries of trauma, the pain of cultural erasure given form in a being who punished those who strayed from tradition or defied caution. His wide hat, his silence, and his sudden appearances, these became the tools of a story meant not only to frighten, but to preserve boundaries. In this light, El Sombrerón is not just a ghost, but a cultural artifact, a living reminder of the deep psychological imprint left by colonial violence. His legend gave voice to the unspeakable, providing a socially acceptable way to warn daughters, protect customs, and explain what could not otherwise be named. And so he endured, long after the landowners disappeared and the colonial flags were taken down. El Sombrerón and the women of the Andes. Among the many recurring themes in the legend of El Sombrerón, one stands out with chilling consistency: his fixation on young women. Specifically, women with long, flowing hair, often described as dark as the shadows he moved through. In towns from Cundinamarca to Quindio, stories circulated of women who heard music in the night, soft guitar notes played with mournful tenderness, and felt compelled to look outside. That was how it began. El Sombrerón, they said, never shouted, never begged. He simply appeared. On horseback. In fine clothing. With eyes that seemed to glint beneath the brim of his impossibly large hat. He did not speak, but somehow made his desires known. Some stories said he offered courtship. Others claimed he simply appeared night after night, until the woman's vitality faded. Until she stopped eating. Until she stopped speaking. These tales had a dual purpose. They warned of malevolent supernatural forces, but also served as veiled discussions of more earthly dangers, predatory men, improper suitors, and the vulnerability of young women in isolated towns. In many retellings, the victims were those who had disobeyed their families, walked alone, or allowed their hair to remain unbraided. The implication was clear: protection came through obedience and ritual, and deviation could invite consequences. At the same time, there was an undercurrent of helplessness in these stories. Many women followed every rule, said every prayer, and still fell under his spell. El Sombrerón, then, was also a symbol of inevitability. A dark force that could not always be thwarted by tradition or piety. For these women, he represented not just supernatural danger, but the inescapable pressures of a society where autonomy was often an illusion. Even in modern times, some families pass down the story with a trace of that original fear. They warn daughters not to whistle at night. Not to answer when someone calls their name from the darkness. Not to leave their hair unbraided. And while they may laugh at the absurdity of the old tales, there's a hush that often follows. A glance at the window. A flicker of remembered unease. The tale of Maria Antonia. In the town of Salento, perched high among coffee fields and eucalyptus trees, the legend of El Sombrerón takes on a name, Maria Antonia. Her story is perhaps the most well-known version of the tale, passed from grandmother to grandchild with a careful cadence reserved for truths too old to question. Maria Antonia was said to be a seamstress, known for her kindness and beauty. She lived with her aging mother in a whitewashed house at the edge of town, where the trees grew thick and the fog lingered long after sunrise. She worked hard, spoke softly, and braided her hair in the traditional way every night before bed. But one day, a stranger came through the town. No one saw his face. Only the black horse, the tailored coat, and the hat that swallowed his features in shadow. He passed her window once. Then again. Then every evening, always when the sun was just below the hills. Soon after, strange things began to happen. Her mother claimed to find her standing in the garden after midnight, humming songs she had never learned. Her stitching grew careless. She seemed always tired. One morning, Maria Antonia was gone. No sign of struggle. No packed bag. Just a faint scent of tobacco and the imprint of hooves near the threshold. Search parties were formed. Prayers were said. But she was never found. And yet, sometimes, in the early morning fog, locals claimed to see a figure in a wide hat standing at the tree line. Not moving. Not speaking. Just waiting. The story of Maria Antonia is often told as a tragic warning, but it is also a quiet expression of grief. Grief for lost daughters, unsolved mysteries, and the parts of life that refuse to fit neatly into logic or reason. Her name, like so many others, became a way to mark sorrow and remember the inexplicable. Disappearances and rumors. Maria Antonia's case was not unique. Across Colombia, tales of unexplained disappearances often found their way into the wider legend of El Sombrerón. While many were never officially linked to the supernatural, villagers often felt otherwise. Especially when certain signs were present. A guitar string found at the scene. Horse tracks where no horses were kept. A whisper caught on the wind that no one could explain. In rural towns where police presence was minimal and formal investigations rare, the line between disappearance and folklore blurred. Rumors filled the silence left by unanswered questions. If a young woman vanished, and there were no signs of travel or foul play, the explanation became obvious to those who believed El Sombrerón had taken her. Sometimes, the rumors went further. That the women weren't dead, but trapped. Kept in some other realm, neither alive nor lost. Some believed they were transformed into spirits themselves, doomed to wander mountain paths just out of reach, appearing briefly in mirrors or at the edge of dreams. Such ideas, while fantastical, served an emotional function. They provided meaning in the face of absence, and hope where no resolution was possible. In the shadow of the unknown, folklore stepped in, not just to scare, but to soothe. When the legend comes home. Not every tale of El Sombrerón was rooted in the distant past. Even today, there are those who claim to have felt his presence. A friend of a friend who heard footsteps on the roof. A cousin who woke to find her braid undone and her window open. A dog who barked for hours at an empty chair. Modern retellings often blend the old and the new. The black horse is replaced by a dark car with tinted windows. The guitar becomes a distant ringtone that plays when no phone is near. But the fear remains the same, quiet, persistent, and just plausible enough to keep you glancing over your shoulder. For many, El Sombrerón is more than a ghost story. He is a symbol of everything that lurks just beyond our understanding. The fears we carry from childhood. The powerlessness we sometimes feel in the face of loss. And the longing for answers that may never come. As we close this segment and begin to move from history into the realm of mystery, let your thoughts drift to those who disappeared, whose names became whispers in the trees. Their stories, like soft echoes through the fog, remind us that belief and memory often walk hand in hand, and that some shadows stretch farther than others. Songs to keep the spirits away. Music in the Andes has always held more than entertainment value. Long before Spanish guitars became common in the region, indigenous peoples used instruments like panpipes, ocarinas, and hand drums not just to celebrate or mourn, but to communicate with the unseen. They understood what many later forgot, that sound carries intention. That certain vibrations soothe, while others summon. In the villages where El Sombrerón name is still whispered, this understanding survives. In many homes, especially those perched at the edge of forests or near rivers, mothers taught their children lullabies that weren't just for sleep. These songs were offerings. Shields made of melody. Sometimes the lyrics named saints or angels. Sometimes they were nonsense syllables passed down for generations, their power lying not in meaning but in rhythm. One particularly common example, still heard today, involves a humming pattern rather than words, meant to mimic the wind and mask the sound of fear. Those who lived closest to the areas where El Sombrerón was said to travel often had a deeper repertoire. These residents knew not to play romantic guitar chords at night, fearing that they might attract him instead of keeping him at bay. In fact, some towns developed strict musical customs. Love songs were reserved for midday, religious hymns were sung at dusk, and a specific melody, passed down orally and never written, was played to sweep the air clean after sunset. Instruments, too, were chosen with care. Brass bells were believed to drive away spirits, while flutes were avoided in the evenings, as their high, hollow tones were thought to mimic the voices of spirits calling through trees. Folk musicians learned to navigate these rules intuitively, embedding them in their performances and passing them to apprentices without ever needing to write them down. This oral culture of musical protection created a quiet resistance to fear, one played on string and skin rather than shouted from rooftops. Even today, in the more rural stretches of the Andes, you may encounter small, locally made songs known simply as Corrientes del Alma, currents of the soul. Played slowly and softly, often on hand-carved guitars or modest marimbas, these pieces are intended to regulate energy, to restore what has been unbalanced. And if one listens closely, the melodies sometimes feel like conversations with the past. Music, then, becomes a cultural balm, a way of responding to fear not with silence, but with carefully chosen sound. In a land haunted by legends, these songs were never about defiance. They were about respect. A gentle way of saying, "We know you walk among us, but tonight, please pass us by." Witch markets and herbal warnings. In the open-air markets of the highlands, between stalls selling fresh guava, woven shawls, and chickens in straw baskets, there was always one booth that drew whispers. Sometimes it was run by an old woman with cataract-clouded eyes. Other times by a quiet man who didn't speak much but always had the right root or powder for the right kind of worry. These were the curanderos, healers, spiritual guides, and protectors against the unseen. Though never officially acknowledged by the church, and often spoken of with caution, these figures formed an essential part of community defense against El Sombrerón and his kin. Their presence was a quiet admission that faith and ritual might not always be enough. Among the most sought-after items were protective sachets, small bundles tied in cotton or corn husk, filled with herbs believed to confuse or repel spirits. Rue, rosemary, and wild verbena were common. More specialized blends might include powdered quartz, snake skin, or petals from flowers that only bloomed at night. These sachets were not meant to be opened or questioned. They were tucked under pillows, sewn into clothing, or buried beneath doorsteps. There were also salves and ointments said to dull the senses to spiritual seduction. Often sold in reused glass jars with handwritten labels, these were rubbed behind the ears or at the base of the neck. Buyers rarely asked what was inside. The ingredients mattered less than the trust in the person who prepared them. Perhaps the most quietly unnerving items were the decoys, small dolls or figures meant to be placed in beds in lieu of a sleeping person. Crafted from wax or cloth, sometimes with a lock of the intended person's hair, they were designed to confuse the gaze of El Sombrerón, or to act as a vessel that could absorb his attention and leave the real person untouched. While outsiders might see these markets as charming or theatrical, locals knew better. Each herb, each charm, was part of a long line of trial and error. Tales of when the protections worked, and when they did not. Even today, some urban herbal shops in Bogotá or Medellín stock items with vague labels: Contra el mal de ojo, para la sombra, defensa del hogar. These remnants of older beliefs persist, tucked between shelves of eucalyptus oil and lavender soap. A quiet legacy of the fear that still echoes through mountain villages, long after the horses' hooves have faded from the cobblestones. The unmarked graves of mountain towns. Hidden just beyond the edge of cleared farmland, often under groves of eucalyptus or near long-forgotten chapels, lie the unmarked graves of those whose stories were never fully told. In many Andean communities, especially during the late colonial period and early republic, burial was not merely a matter of logistics. It was a statement of inclusion, or exclusion. And those believed to have been touched by El Sombrerón were often denied rest. There were whispers about what happened to those who vanished. Some believed they were spirited away to another realm. Others claimed they were found, but in such states of confusion, silence, or death that they could not be returned to normal society. In the cruelest cases, families were instructed to bury their loved ones outside of town limits. To leave no marker. To pretend it never happened. Why such cruelty? Because contact with El Sombrerón was thought to taint. To bring a kind of spiritual rot that could spread like disease. Superstition held that these individuals might rise again. Not as zombies or ghosts in the theatrical sense, but as vessels for lingering energy, trapped halfway between the human and the spectral. As a result, entire generations lie in unnamed plots. Some are remembered through family stories, others only through hints: a rose bush that blooms in winter, a patch of ground no one dares to clear. Archaeologists in Colombia have occasionally stumbled upon these resting places, small clusters of bones with no accompanying artifacts, buried in positions that suggest haste, secrecy, or shame. Academic reports list them as isolated burials, but locals know better. And then there are the gravestones that are marked, but tell a different kind of story. Found in tiny cemeteries behind crumbling churches, some bear only first names. Others include carvings of hats or horseshoes, symbols not of mourning, but of warning. These markers serve as quiet reminders: here lies someone who was touched by darkness. Keep walking. Mirrors, braids, and bands, cultural protection practices. Within the homes of the Andean highlands, daily life became a choreography of unseen protections. Some were visible, like crosses on doors or iron nails placed above windows. But others, more subtle, held centuries of cultural meaning, adapted from indigenous beliefs, colonial impositions, and whispered folklore. The placement of mirrors was one such practice. Never opposite a bed. Never facing a door. In fact, mirrors were covered at night in many households, not out of vanity, but out of fear. The belief was that El Sombrerón could use mirrors as portals. That he might appear within them rather than outside. And worse, that if your reflection moved on its own, it might no longer belong to you. Braids, as mentioned before, were more than hairstyles. They were boundary markers. A girl with loose hair was open. Vulnerable. But a tight braid, especially one knotted in a figure eight, was like a lock. A shield. Some families believed that braiding hair while reciting psalms or indigenous chants created a protective weave, physical and spiritual. Children were taught not to whistle after dark. Not to wear black without a reason. Not to open the door unless 3 knocks came first, never 2. And to never, ever sleep with feet pointing toward a window. Schools, too, incorporated these practices in quiet ways. Teachers left bells hanging by classroom doors, not for summoning, but for clearing energy. Folk prayers were woven into morning routines. And during certain weeks, when the fog settled too thick, or strange dreams were shared across households, there were informal bans on sleepovers, late walks, or music after sunset. These weren't the rules of superstition. They were the architecture of survival. An inherited language of precaution spoken fluently by communities who understood that the world was full of more than what could be seen. And that protection, like fear, lives in the smallest things. The way a mirror is tilted, the way a ribbon is tied, the moment you choose to turn out the light. Priests, landowners, and the control of fear. As the soft candlelight of rural Andean homes flickered against adobe walls, a different kind of illumination cast its glow from the pulpits of mountain churches. The priests, dressed in cassocks and bound by both faith and hierarchy, spoke of salvation and sin. But in many towns, they also played another role entirely, custodians of fear. Specifically, the fear surrounding El Sombrerón. To the church, the legend presented a unique dilemma. On one hand, it diverted attention from official teachings. A spirit that haunted the faithful, ignored sacraments, and appeared outside canonical scripture could threaten religious order. But on the other hand, it was an incredibly effective instrument of control. And so, priests across the Andes walked a delicate line, neither fully endorsing the legend, nor denouncing it entirely. In Sunday homilies, stories of El Sombrerón were sometimes recast through a biblical lens. He became a metaphor for temptation, a stand-in for the devil, a punishment for those who disobeyed their elders or allowed pride, vanity, or lust to take root in their hearts. In this rebranding, El Sombrerón was not a supernatural anomaly to be explained or dismissed, but a cautionary tale perfectly aligned with Catholic morality. Priests performed blessings not just on people, but on homes and hair combs. Holy water was sprinkled on garden paths. Children were taught that true faith offered the only real protection, and that even the strongest of braids would unravel without proper devotion. These practices helped maintain the Church's authority, reinforcing the idea that spiritual safety could be purchased not through herbs or charms, but through sacrament and obedience. This spiritual interpretation of the legend also extended into confession. Young women, fearful of unexplained dreams or uninvited feelings, would whisper their worries to the priest. Had they attracted El Sombrerón somehow? Had their thoughts or behavior opened a door? The Church responded with penance, prayer, and guidance that almost always led them back toward prescribed roles and expectations. In this way, the legend became a subtle force of discipline, wrapped in the language of protection. But it wasn't only the clergy who saw value in the myth. In estates overlooking these same villages, white houses with red clay tiles, iron gates, and views of terrace coffee farms, the landowning class watched El Sombrerón legend evolve with measured interest. For them, superstition was both quaint and convenient. It encouraged conformity. It kept people home after dark. It discouraged romantic liaisons that might disrupt social hierarchies. For these elites, the fear of El Sombrerón was never about personal safety. They rarely walked alone, never without servants, and their daughters were guarded by layers of protocol. But they understood how fear worked. How it shaped behavior in ways that no decree or sermon ever could. There are accounts, though always quiet, always indirect, that suggest some landowners used the legend to manipulate. To explain away disappearances. To silence rumors. To shift blame from the human to the spectral. And in doing so, they deepened the legend's roots. In this context, El Sombrerón becomes more than a ghost story. He becomes a mirror, reflecting the power structures of a society built on inequality and reinforced through fear. El Sombrerón as a tool of social order. Throughout rural Colombia, especially during the 19th century, social expectations were tightly woven into daily life. Gender roles were clearly delineated. Class distinctions were marked by dress, speech, and access. And within this lattice of expectations, El Sombrerón lurked as a silent enforcer. A woman accused of attracting El Sombrerón might be quietly shamed, not just for alleged spiritual vulnerability, but for failing to conform. Was she too proud? Too flirtatious? Did she walk alone when she shouldn't have? These questions cloaked deeper criticisms in the language of morality. The supernatural became a canvas on which society painted its anxieties, about change, rebellion, independence. Conversely, men who claimed to see El Sombrerón were treated with a different kind of suspicion. Were they cowards? Were they drunk? Or, perhaps, they were using the story themselves to deflect scrutiny or guilt. In some cases, such sightings even became a currency of gossip, stories passed from ear to ear, reshaped with each telling, reinforcing the legend while subtly policing behavior. For children, the legend functioned much like the tales of El Coco or La Llorona, an ambient fear used to keep them close to home, obedient, and wary of the unknown. El Sombrerón will hear you, mothers would murmur when tempers flared. He listens for disobedient voices. The message was clear: conformity was safety. Silence was wisdom. These social dynamics meant that belief in El Sombrerón was never just about faith in the supernatural. It was about survival. Belief offered a kind of insurance, social, spiritual, and emotional. To express doubt could mark one as arrogant. To express too much belief could mark one as fragile. The balance required was delicate, and the consequences of misstepping could be severe. Class and the threshold of belief. Interestingly, the degree to which someone feared El Sombrerón often correlated with their place in the social hierarchy. For the wealthy, the legend was something spoken of with amusement. My nurse used to say, "The old cook still won't whistle after dark." It became part of a performative folklore, something quaint to share over dinner, or evoked during carnival as a symbol of local color. For the working class, however, belief was not optional. It was interwoven with lived experience, passed through generations not as entertainment, but as instruction. These were the people who actually walked the dark paths. Who lived in creaking houses near groves where the wind whispered strange things. Who relied on dogs, bells, and prayers because they had no other protection. In this sense, El Sombrerón became a symbol of the divide between the lived and the leisurely. Between those who feared the dark because they lived in it, and those who feared only stories. The performance of fear. As time passed and towns modernized, the legend began to take on a new dimension: performance. Local festivals, especially those tied to saints' days or cultural heritage, began including dramatic reenactments of El Sombrerón sightings. A man in a wide-brimmed hat would ride through the plaza, silent and still, followed by gasps and laughter. For the young, it became a game. For elders, a memory. But even in the laughter, there remained a trace of tension. A recognition that the fear was never fully gone. That stories do not die, they simply learn new rhythms. And so, fear became something both felt and worn. A garment passed down, altered by time, but never discarded entirely. In the quiet gestures of older villages, locking a window before sunset, braiding a granddaughter's hair with care, you could still glimpse the heartbeat of belief. Still hear the echo of a horse's hooves, far off in the night. Legacy in the modern era. Today, El Sombrerón lives on not just in whispered stories, but in art, theater, and literature. He appears in shadowy illustrations, in slow songs sung by aging guitarists, and in the soft lines of poetry that recall the days when people feared the mist more than the man. Yet even now, when cell phones light the way and satellite dishes perch on red-tiled roofs, there are places where his story is told without irony. Where his name is spoken only in daylight. Where dogs still bark at nothing. Where a mother, brushing out her daughter's hair, pauses for a moment before tying the first braid, eyes flicking to the window, just in case. For in the end, El Sombrerón is not merely a legend, a ghost, or a tool of control. He is all of these, and something more. He is the memory of fear. The structure of belief. The shadow at the edge of what society allows itself to say. And so, as we gently draw this journey to a close, let us return, slowly, softly, to the quiet towns of the Andes. To the fog that drifts down ancient paths. To the rhythms of superstition, control, and community. Even now, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint strum of a guitar. A rhythm, just beyond the trees. Where shadows settle and morning waits. Now, as our journey through cobbled alleys and cloud-wrapped mountains draws to a close, allow yourself to exhale, softly, deeply, as if releasing the mist of all that has come before. You've walked through a world where the flicker of lantern light held the dark at bay, where footsteps in the night invited quiet dread, and where the shape of a hat could cast doubt over all that was known and trusted. El Sombrerón, that enigmatic figure who has haunted Andean folklore for generations, stands not merely as a ghost of fear, but as a reflection of power and silence, of forgotten names and unspoken rules, of rituals passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, until they became as natural as breath. You've stood beside midwives moving through the fog, their lanterns trembling slightly with every step. You've listened to whispers rustle through eucalyptus groves, to the cries of dogs who sense what we cannot. You've seen how communities fortified their homes not just with locks and latches, but with songs, braids, salt, and prayers. All these, not to fight the darkness, but to live with it, to shape it, to coexist with what could not be controlled. And beneath it all, you've witnessed how society itself played a part in feeding the legend, how priests and landowners wrapped superstition in sermons and silence, how fear was channeled through expectations, obedience, and quiet submission. A tool, a truth, a tale. But as we return now, slowly, like the turning of an old wooden door, let us not carry that fear with us. Instead, we carry understanding. A softness for those who lived with uncertainty. An appreciation for the quiet strength it takes to live each day with one eye on the horizon and one foot in shadow. Because fear, when understood, becomes something else. It becomes memory, history, a rhythm passed through generations, like the gentle strumming of a guitar whose notes hang in the air long after the hand has stilled. So let the sounds of El Sombrerón fade now, his footsteps, his horse, his mournful music, all receding into the fog of centuries. Let the streets grow quiet again, the lamps dim, and the dogs settle once more beside their doors. You are safe. You are still. The journey is done. And somewhere, high in the Andes, the wind shifts through the trees, carrying with it a song too soft to hear and a story too old to end. Sleep well. Close your eyes and let yourself drift backward through time, to a Colombia where the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as morning mist over the Magdalena River. Tonight, we journey into the heart of one of Latin America's most enduring ghost stories, La Llorona, the Weeping Woman, but we won't simply retell the tale you may already know. Instead, we'll wade slowly through the muddy waters of history itself, exploring how this legend grew from whispered warnings in colonial villages to become a cultural touchstone that still echoes through modern Colombian nights. Imagine yourself settling into the rhythm of a story that has been told and retold for centuries, each telling adding another layer, another detail, another reason why mothers still warn their children to stay away from rivers after dark. This is not a tale of sudden scares or dramatic revelations. Rather, it unfolds like the slow current of a river at twilight, steady, inevitable, and strangely comforting in its ancient familiarity. As we begin, picture the Colombia of centuries past. A land where Spanish colonial architecture cast long shadows over indigenous traditions, where Catholic bells rang across valleys that had once echoed with different ceremonies, and where every river, every stream, every quiet pond held memories that the living preferred not to disturb. In this world, the line between history and legend was not clearly drawn, and perhaps it didn't need to be. The sound of water will follow us throughout our journey tonight, sometimes the gentle babble of a mountain stream, sometimes the deep flow of the great rivers that snake through Colombia's heartland, and sometimes, just sometimes, the sound of weeping that might be the wind, or might be something else entirely. The hidden truths behind Colombia's La Llorona. In the small towns and villages that dotted colonial Colombia, life moved to the rhythm of church bells and river currents. The day began before dawn with the soft shuffle of bare feet on cobblestones, as women made their way to the communal wells and riverbanks that served as the social heartbeat of every settlement. These were not the hurried mornings of our modern world, but slow, deliberate beginnings where each task carried the weight of tradition and necessity. Picture yourself in one of these villages, perhaps along the banks of the Cauca River, in the early 1700s. The houses are low and thick-walled, built to keep out both the heat of the day and the whispers of the night. Adobe walls painted in soft yellows and blues catch the first light of dawn, while red tile roofs gleam like scales in the growing brightness. Gardens burst with plantains and coffee bushes, their broad leaves heavy with morning dew that will be gone within the hour. The women gather at the river's edge, their wooden washboards creating a gentle percussion that mingles with the sound of flowing water. This is where news travels, where gossip spreads, and where the oldest stories are kept alive through repetition. The rhythm of washing clothes becomes a kind of meditation. Scrub, rinse, wring, repeat, while voices rise and fall in the comfortable cadence of communal work. But even in these peaceful morning hours, there are undercurrents of unease. Maria, who runs the small tienda near the church, always glances upstream before kneeling to fill her water jug. Old Carmen makes the sign of the cross when the wind picks up, sending ripples across the water's surface. These gestures have become as automatic as breathing, passed down from mother to daughter like family recipes or the secrets of weaving. River nights and lantern watch. As evening approaches, the character of these riverside communities changes completely. The cheerful morning bustle gives way to something more cautious, more deliberate. Families draw closer together, and conversations that were loud and easy in the daylight become hushed, intimate affairs. Windows are shuttered not just against the cool mountain air, but against whatever might be moving in the darkness beyond. The rivers themselves seem different at night. Water that sparkled cheerfully in the sunshine now moves with a darker purpose, reflecting not the blue sky but the deep shadows of overhanging trees and the occasional flicker of a lantern carried by some late traveler. The sound changes too. What was once a pleasant babble becomes something more like whispered conversation, as if the water itself has secrets to share. In these Colombian villages, certain people took on the responsibility of being watchers. They weren't appointed by any official authority, but rather emerged naturally from the community, usually older women who had lived long enough to understand the rhythms of both the natural and supernatural worlds. Dona Isabel might station herself on her front porch, which faced the river path, working quietly on her endless embroidery while keeping one eye on the water. Her presence was both comfort and warning to her neighbors, comfort because someone was watching, warning because watching was necessary. These watchers carried small oil lamps or candles in glass holders, creating tiny points of light that served as informal lighthouses for anyone who might need to venture out after dark. The lights also served another purpose. They were a signal to whatever might be out there that this was protected space, watch space, space where the living still held dominion. On particularly quiet nights, when the wind was still and the river ran low, these watchers sometimes reported hearing things that made them grip their rosaries a little tighter. A sound like crying, distant but unmistakably human. A splash that was too deliberate to be a fish jumping, too large to be a fallen branch. Sometimes, if the moon was dark and the mist heavy, they claimed to see a pale figure moving along the riverbank, always at the very edge of vision, always disappearing when looked at directly. Children who sleep with salt. The children of these river communities grew up with a very specific set of rules and rituals, many of which seemed designed to protect them from dangers that were never explicitly named. Parents spoke in careful euphemisms and half-finished warnings, creating an atmosphere where fear was real but shapeless, present but never quite defined. Every child learned early that certain areas near the river were forbidden after sunset. These weren't arbitrary restrictions, but boundaries passed down through generations, marked not by signs or fences but by the collective memory of tragedy. The bend in the river where young Miguel had drowned 3 summers ago. The deep pool beneath the old bridge where no one went swimming anymore, not since that terrible night when Anna's baby sister had wandered off and was found floating face down at dawn. Salt played an important role in these children's lives, though they rarely understood why until they were older. Mothers would sprinkle salt on windowsills and doorsteps with the same casual regularity that they swept floors or lit cooking fires. Small cloth pouches of blessed salt were sewn into clothing, hidden in pockets, tucked under pillows. Children were told it was for protection, for blessing, for keeping bad things away, but the specific nature of those bad things remained frustratingly vague. At bedtime, the ritual was always the same. After prayers were said and final kisses exchanged, mothers would check that the salt was in place, a pinch under the pillow, a line across the windowsill. Children who asked too many questions about these practices were told they would understand when they were older, a promise that carried both comfort and dread. The salt became a talisman of childhood itself, a protection that would eventually be unnecessary once they grew large enough and wise enough to protect themselves. Some children, particularly those who lived in houses closest to the water, developed the habit of waking in the middle of the night to listen. They would lie perfectly still in their small beds, ears straining to separate the familiar sounds of night, wind in the trees, the distant call of night birds, the gentle flow of water, from anything that might be unusual, anything that might be dangerous. This vigilance became so ingrained that many of them continued the practice well into adulthood, never quite able to sleep deeply when living near water. Life near the water, a constant risk. The relationship between these Colombian communities and their rivers was one of profound ambivalence. The water was essential for life, for drinking, washing, cooking, transportation, and trade, but it was also the source of constant anxiety and frequent tragedy. Every family had stories of loved ones claimed by rivers, and these stories shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. River crossings were never undertaken lightly. Even the most familiar fords and bridges required a certain mental preparation, a brief moment of gathering courage and invoking protection. Travelers would often make the sign of the cross before stepping into shallow water, and experienced guides knew to move quickly and purposefully, never lingering in the middle of a crossing. The water seemed patient but hungry, willing to wait for the careless or the unlucky. Women washing clothes worked in groups not just for company, but for safety. If someone slipped on the wet rocks or was caught by an unexpected current, others would be there to pull them back to shore. Children were watched constantly when they played near the water, and specific older children were assigned as watchers, responsible for raising an alarm if anyone ventured too close to dangerous areas. The rainy season brought its own particular dangers. Rivers that were manageable streams in the dry months could become torrents overnight, washing away bridges, flooding homes, and creating new channels that obliterated familiar landmarks. During these months, entire communities would sometimes relocate to higher ground, abandoning their riverside homes to the muddy waters until the floods receded. Yet despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, the rivers were also places of profound spiritual significance. They were where baptisms took place, where certain feast days were celebrated with flower petals cast upon the water, where young couples went to make promises to each other and to whatever spirits might be listening. The water gave life and took it away with equal measure, and the people who lived beside it learned to accept this duality as a fundamental truth of existence. Listening for crying that's not your own. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of life in these riverside communities was the constant need to distinguish between the many sounds that water makes and the sounds that might indicate something else entirely. Rivers, especially at night, produce an almost infinite variety of noises, gurgling over rocks, lapping against banks, echoing through culverts and under bridges. To the untrained ear, these sounds might include what could easily be mistaken for human voices, human crying, human distress. But the people who lived their entire lives beside these waters developed an extraordinary sensitivity to these auditory subtleties. They learned to differentiate between the sound of water flowing over different types of surfaces, the difference between a current moving fast and one moving slow, the way sound traveled differently on humid nights versus dry ones. This knowledge was not academic but essential, a matter of survival and sanity. When someone claimed to hear crying near the river, the community response was both skeptical and deeply serious. Skeptical because water makes many sounds that can deceive the ear, serious because sometimes the crying was real, and real crying near water at night usually meant someone was in terrible danger. Search parties would form quickly, lanterns would be lit, and people would spread out along the banks, calling softly and listening carefully. The most experienced listeners, usually older women who had spent decades beside the water, could often tell within moments whether the crying they heard was human or not. They spoke of subtle differences in rhythm, in pitch, in the way the sound seemed to move. Human crying, they said, had weight to it, a groundedness that anchored it to a specific location. Other crying, the kind that made them clutch their shawls tighter and hurry past, seemed to float, to drift, to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Children were taught to trust these distinctions, even when they couldn't yet hear them themselves. If an adult suddenly stopped walking and tilted their head to listen, children knew to be absolutely silent and ready to run. If that adult then relaxed and continued walking, they could relax too. But if the adult's face grew tight with concern, if they began to walk faster or change direction entirely, then the children knew that whatever had been heard was not something they wanted to encounter. This careful listening became a form of meditation for many, a way of staying connected to the rhythms of their environment while remaining alert to anything that might disrupt those rhythms. The sound of genuine human distress carried urgency and specificity. It called for help, it originated from a particular location, it changed as the person moved or as their situation evolved. The other kind of crying, the kind that wasn't quite human, seemed to exist outside of time and space, eternal and unchanging, like an echo that had somehow become separated from its original source. The woman behind the legend. While La Llorona exists now as myth and legend, woven into the fabric of Colombian folklore like threads in an ancient tapestry, the story likely began with a real woman whose grief became so profound, so consuming, that it transcended the boundaries between life and death. To understand how one person's tragedy could echo through centuries, we must imagine ourselves in the social world of colonial Colombia, where individual pain often became collective memory. Picture Maria Elena Vasquez, though her real name has been lost to time, swallowed by the river of years that separates us from her story. She lived in a small settlement along the Magdalena River in the mid-1600s, during those early decades when Spanish colonial rule was still establishing its rhythm over indigenous lands. She was perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of beauty that made young men forget their manners and old women purse their lips in disapproval. Her story begins like so many others of that era, a young woman caught between worlds, between the expectations of colonial society and the older ways that still whispered through the valleys. She had fallen in love with a man whose social position made their union impossible. Perhaps he was married already, bound by family obligations to a woman of appropriate breeding and dowry. Perhaps he was a Spanish official whose career would be destroyed by association with a woman of indigenous or mixed heritage. The specifics matter less than the impossibility of their situation. What we can imagine, based on countless similar stories from that period, is the weight of secrecy that surrounded their relationship. Stolen meetings by moonlight, messages passed through trusted intermediaries, the constant fear of discovery. In colonial Colombia, a woman's reputation was as fragile as spider silk, and once broken, nearly impossible to repair. Maria Elena would have lived each day walking a tightrope between desire and propriety, between love and survival. When she found herself with child, or perhaps with children, as some versions of the legend suggest twins, the precarious balance of her life shifted irreversibly. In a society where illegitimate children brought shame not just to the mother but to her entire family, where economic survival often depended on maintaining social respectability, she faced a choice between impossible alternatives. Keep the children and face social exile, or find some other solution that her desperate mind convinced her was merciful. Variations from region to region. As the story of La Llorona spread throughout Colombia, it adapted to local conditions and concerns like water flowing around stones in a riverbed. Each region, each community, each generation added its own details, its own explanations, its own warnings, until the legend became not one story but many stories, all sharing the central image of a woman weeping by the water. In the coffee-growing regions of the central Andes, La Llorona became associated with the seasonal workers who came to harvest the precious beans. Mothers warned their children that she appeared during the harvest months, when strangers filled the villages and social order became temporarily disrupted. Here, she was said to wear the white dress of a coffee picker, stained with the red juice of cherries, her weeping a lament for children lost to the demands of economic necessity. Along the Caribbean coast, where the influence of African cultural traditions remained strong despite centuries of colonial suppression, La Llorona took on different characteristics. She became intertwined with water spirits from Yoruba mythology, a figure who moved between the fresh water of rivers and the salt water of the sea. Coastal versions of the story often emphasized her connection to storms and flooding, suggesting that her grief had the power to summon destructive weather that could wash away entire communities. In the Amazon regions, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural world was understood differently than in the more Europeanized highlands, La Llorona became a protector as well as a threat. Indigenous communities incorporated her into existing beliefs about river spirits, creating versions where her weeping served as a warning about dangerous currents or hidden obstacles in the water. She became a tragic but ultimately benevolent figure, using her eternal punishment to prevent others from suffering similar losses. The mountain communities of the Eastern Cordillera developed perhaps the most psychologically complex version of the legend. Here, La Llorona was said to appear to women who were struggling with the demands of motherhood, particularly during the difficult early years when children required constant care and attention. Her weeping became a reflection of maternal anxiety, the fear that every mother carries of failing to protect their children from the countless dangers of the world. Each regional variation reflected the specific fears and concerns of its community. Where child mortality was high due to disease, La Llorona became associated with epidemic illness. Where economic hardship forced families to separate, she represented the grief of mothers whose children had been sent away to work or live with relatives. Where indigenous traditions conflicted with Catholic teachings, she embodied the spiritual confusion and cultural displacement that many people experienced. The disappearance of Rosa Maria. One particular case that may have contributed to the strengthening of the La Llorona legend occurred in the town of Honda, along the Magdalena River, in 1743. The disappearance of Rosa Maria Gutierrez and her two young children sent shockwaves through the community and provided what seemed like contemporary evidence that the legend was more than just old wives' tales. Rosa Maria was known throughout Honda as a devoted mother and skilled seamstress whose embroidered altar cloths were prized by the local church. She lived alone with her children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, in a small house near the river, supporting them through her needlework and occasional washing for wealthier families. Neighbors described her as quiet but not withdrawn, someone who participated in community life but always seemed to carry a sadness that she kept carefully hidden. The first sign that something was wrong came when Father Miguel arrived for his weekly visit to bless her latest work and found the house empty. The door stood open, breakfast sat half-prepared on the rough wooden table, and Rosa Maria's sewing box lay overturned on the floor, its contents scattered like fallen leaves. The bed showed signs of a restless night, but there was no indication of violence or struggle. Search parties formed immediately, following the paths Rosa Maria might have taken if she had gone to the river for water or washing. What they found troubled them more than if they had found nothing at all. At the riverbank, in the soft mud where women typically knelt to scrub clothes, they discovered 2 sets of small footprints leading toward the water, but no adult prints accompanying them. Rosa Maria's washing paddle floated in the shallows, along with a child's small sandal. For 3 days, the entire community searched. They dragged nets through the deeper pools, explored every cave and crevice along the riverbank, sent riders to neighboring towns to ask if anyone had seen a woman traveling with 2 young children. Gradually, a terrible theory began to take shape, that Rosa Maria, driven by some desperate circumstance that no one had recognized, had led her children to the river and, the possibility was too awful to speak aloud. On the 4th night, old Carmen, who lived closest to the river, reported hearing the sound of crying coming from the water. Not the natural sounds that water sometimes makes, she insisted, but genuine human weeping, the sound of a woman in unbearable grief. Other neighbors came to listen, and several confirmed what Carmen had heard. The crying continued intermittently for weeks, always at night, always from the same stretch of river where Rosa Maria's washing paddle had been found. When the legend reached the capital. The spread of the La Llorona legend from rural villages to urban centers like Bogotá reflects the broader patterns of cultural transmission in colonial Colombia. As indigenous and mixed-race populations migrated to cities seeking economic opportunities, they brought their stories with them, where these tales encountered different social conditions and took on new meanings. In Bogotá during the late 1700s, the legend initially circulated primarily among domestic servants, market vendors, and other working-class residents who maintained connections to rural communities. These urban versions of the story often emphasized themes of social inequality and lost opportunity, reflecting the specific challenges faced by people trying to establish new lives in an unfamiliar environment. The legend gained particular traction in the neighborhoods that surrounded the Rio San Francisco, which flowed through the heart of the colonial city before being covered over in later centuries. These areas housed many recent migrants from rural areas, people who found themselves caught between their traditional ways of understanding the world and the demands of urban colonial society. For them, La Llorona represented both the dangers of abandoning traditional values and the tragic consequences of being unable to adapt to new circumstances. Wealthy residents of the capital initially dismissed these stories as superstitions of the uneducated classes. However, as the legend persisted and gained detail, some began to see it as a useful moral tale that reinforced proper social behavior. The story of a woman punished for transgressing social boundaries appealed to colonial authorities who were constantly concerned with maintaining order and hierarchy in their diverse and potentially unstable society. The transformation of La Llorona from rural folktale to urban legend was completed when the story began appearing in the sermons of Catholic priests, who used it as an example of the consequences of sin and the importance of maternal duty. These official endorsements gave the legend a kind of institutional legitimacy that it had previously lacked, helping to ensure its survival through changing social conditions. By the early 1800s, as Colombia moved toward independence from Spain, the La Llorona legend had become thoroughly integrated into the cultural landscape of both rural and urban areas. It served multiple functions simultaneously: entertainment, moral instruction, psychological outlet, and cultural continuity, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining its essential emotional core. A new generation of fear. As Colombia transitioned from colonial rule to independence and then through the turbulent years of the early republic, the La Llorona legend evolved to reflect new anxieties and social pressures. The wars of independence, the collapse of traditional social structures, and the emergence of new forms of political and economic organization created conditions where old legends took on fresh relevance. During the independence wars, when families were separated by conflict and economic hardship, reports of La Llorona sightings increased dramatically. Mothers whose sons had been pressed into military service, wives whose husbands had disappeared into the chaos of war, children orphaned by violence, all found in the legend a way to express grief that was too large and too complex for ordinary language to contain. The figure of La Llorona became a symbol of loss that transcended individual tragedy. She represented not just one woman's grief for her children, but an entire generation's mourning for the familiar world that was disappearing. Her eternal weeping echoed the sounds of a society in transformation, where old certainties were crumbling and new ones had not yet taken their place. Young people growing up during this period of upheaval often reported more intense and frequent encounters with La Llorona than their parents had experienced. Perhaps this was because they were more sensitive to the underlying anxieties of their time, or perhaps because the social disruption of the independence period had somehow weakened the barriers between the world of the living and the realm of spirits and memories. The legend also began to incorporate elements that reflected contemporary concerns about national identity and cultural authenticity. La Llorona became not just a tragic individual but a representation of indigenous and mixed-race Colombia, weeping for children, both literal and metaphorical, who had been lost to foreign influences and colonial oppression. Her story offered a way for people to connect with pre-Columbian traditions while acknowledging the irreversible changes that colonization had brought. As the 19th century progressed and Colombia struggled to establish stable political institutions, La Llorona endured as one of the few cultural constants that transcended regional, ethnic, and class divisions. Rich and poor, indigenous and European, urban and rural, all knew her story, even if they understood it differently. In a country that often seemed on the verge of fragmenting into its component parts, the legend provided a rare source of shared cultural experience. La Llorona in pre-Columbian water myths. Long before Spanish conquistadors set foot on Colombian soil, the indigenous peoples of this region had developed complex mythologies centered around water spirits and the supernatural powers of rivers, lakes, and springs. Archaeological evidence and surviving oral traditions suggest that the figure we now know as La Llorona may have roots that extend back over 1,000 years, connecting her to ancient beliefs about the relationship between women, water, and the realm of the dead. The Muisca people, who inhabited the highlands around present-day Bogotá, told stories of Bachu, the mother goddess who emerged from Lake Guatavita with a child in her arms. After populating the earth with her descendants, Bachu transformed herself and her child into serpents and returned to the sacred waters from which they had come. This myth shares striking parallels with later La Llorona stories, a maternal figure associated with water, the theme of children lost and found, and the idea that powerful emotions could bind spirits to specific locations. Along the Caribbean coast, the Tairona civilization developed beliefs about Naoa, a water spirit who appeared as a beautiful woman to lure fishermen to their deaths. But Naoa was not simply malicious, she was also understood as a guardian of the ocean's mysteries, someone who tested the worthiness of those who sought to take from the sea's bounty. Her crying was said to warn of storms and dangerous currents, making her both threat and protector, a duality that would later characterize many versions of La Llorona. The Waya people of the Guadra Peninsula spoke of Puloi, a female spirit associated with droughts and floods, whose emotions could literally reshape the landscape. When Puloi grieved, the rains would come in torrents, washing away entire settlements. When she was angry, the rivers would dry up, leaving communities desperate for water. These stories suggest that pre-Columbian cultures understood a deep connection between feminine emotional states and the behavior of natural water systems. Archaeological investigations at sites like Ciudad Perdida in the Sierra Nevada have uncovered evidence of elaborate water management systems that incorporated spiritual as well as practical elements. Stone channels and pools were designed not only to direct water flow but also to create specific acoustic effects. The sound of water moving through these structures would have resembled human voices or crying, suggesting that indigenous engineers deliberately incorporated the spiritual power of water sounds into their urban planning. When Spanish colonizers arrived and began the process of cultural suppression and religious conversion, many of these water-related beliefs went underground rather than disappearing entirely. Indigenous communities learned to express their traditional spiritual concepts through the language and imagery of Catholic saints and biblical stories, creating syncretic beliefs that preserved ancient wisdom while appearing to conform to colonial religious requirements. Oral histories and ghost mapping. The systematic collection of La Llorona stories throughout Colombia reveals fascinating patterns that suggest the legend may preserve genuine historical and geographical information alongside its supernatural elements. Folklorists and anthropologists who have spent decades recording these oral histories have discovered that certain locations are consistently associated with La Llorona sightings across multiple generations of storytellers, even when those storytellers have no apparent connection to each other. Professor Elena Martinez of the Universidad Nacional spent 15 years in the 1980s and 1990s traveling through rural Colombian communities, recording every version of the La Llorona story she could find. Her archive contains over 800 distinct tellings, each one carefully documented with information about the storyteller's age, background, and family history. When she began plotting these stories on maps, remarkable patterns emerged. Certain stretches of river appeared in La Llorona stories far more frequently than others, even when those locations had no obvious geographical features that would make them particularly dangerous or notable. These hot spots often corresponded to areas where historical records documented unusual numbers of drowning deaths, particularly involving women and children. In some cases, the correlation was so strong that Martinez began to wonder whether the legend was serving as a kind of oral archive, preserving information about dangerous locations that might otherwise have been forgotten. The timing of reported sightings also showed intriguing patterns. La Llorona appearances clustered around certain times of the year, particularly during the transition between dry and rainy seasons, when river conditions could change rapidly and unpredictably. Local storytellers often connected these seasonal patterns to agricultural cycles, suggesting that the legend served practical as well as spiritual functions, reminding communities to be extra cautious around water during times when conditions were most likely to change. Perhaps most remarkably, Martinez's research revealed that many La Llorona stories contained surprisingly accurate information about historical events and people, even when told by narrators who claimed no knowledge of formal history. Stories about La Llorona appearing during specific battles or political crises often aligned closely with documented historical timelines, suggesting that the legend was serving as a vehicle for preserving collective memory about traumatic community experiences. One particularly striking example involved stories from the Tolima region that described La Llorona wearing the uniform of a particular military unit from the 1850 civil wars. Historical records confirmed that this unit had indeed been stationed in the area and had been involved in a massacre of civilians near a river crossing. The legend seemed to be preserving not just the emotional impact of this trauma but specific visual details that would have been important to witnesses and survivors. The role of the river in indigenous mythology. To understand the full cultural significance of La Llorona, we must appreciate the central role that rivers played in pre-Columbian spirituality. For indigenous peoples throughout the region, rivers were not simply geographical features or sources of water, but living entities with their own personalities, desires, and forms of consciousness. This animistic worldview created a foundation upon which later legends like La Llorona could take root and flourish. The concept of rivers as pathways between worlds was particularly important in indigenous mythology. Water was understood as a medium through which spirits could travel between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, making riverbanks liminal spaces where supernatural encounters were not only possible but expected. The sound of flowing water was often interpreted as the voices of ancestors, offering guidance, warnings, or simply maintaining connection with their living descendants. Different types of water features held different spiritual significance. Fast-moving mountain streams were associated with quick, decisive communication from the spirit world, messages that demanded immediate attention and action. Slow, deep rivers were understood as places for longer, more contemplative interactions with supernatural forces. Springs and pools were seen as portals where the boundary between worlds was thinnest, making them both sacred and potentially dangerous. The Embera people of the Pacific coast developed particularly sophisticated beliefs about water spirits and their relationship to human emotional states. They understood that intense grief, anger, or love could create spiritual imprints in water, causing rivers and streams to hold and replay human emotions long after the original experiences had ended. This concept provides a framework for understanding how individual tragedies could become permanent features of the spiritual landscape. Seasonal changes in water levels were interpreted as evidence of the ongoing emotional lives of river spirits. Floods were understood as expressions of joy or anger, droughts as periods of sadness or withdrawal. This meant that human communities needed to maintain ongoing relationships with these water spirits, offering prayers, ceremonies, and gifts to ensure that their emotional states remained favorable to human habitation and travel. The arrival of Spanish colonizers and the imposition of Catholic religious practices created a crisis in these traditional water-based spiritual systems. Indigenous communities found themselves caught between ancient beliefs that had guided their ancestors for centuries and new religious requirements that often directly contradicted traditional practices. The La Llorona legend emerged partially as a way to resolve this conflict, providing a figure that could embody traditional water spirit beliefs while appearing to conform to Catholic moral teachings. Haunting as moral lesson. Evolution of the tale. As La Llorona stories spread throughout Colombian society, they gradually evolved from simple supernatural encounters into complex moral narratives that served multiple social functions. The legend became a vehicle for transmitting cultural values, particularly regarding gender roles, family responsibilities, and the consequences of transgressing social boundaries. This evolution reflects the dynamic nature of oral tradition, where stories adapt to serve the changing needs of the communities that tell them. In its earliest forms, the La Llorona story appears to have been primarily cautionary, warning people about the physical dangers of rivers and the importance of staying alert near water. These practical safety messages were wrapped in supernatural elements that made them more memorable and emotionally compelling than simple direct warnings would have been. The figure of the weeping woman served as a kind of spiritual alarm system, alerting communities to environmental hazards. As Colombian society became more stratified during the colonial period, La Llorona stories began incorporating themes about social class and appropriate behavior for people of different backgrounds. Versions told in upper-class households often emphasized the importance of maintaining family honor and avoiding associations with people of lower social status. Working-class versions of the story focused more on the economic pressures that could drive women to desperate actions. The integration of Catholic moral teachings into La Llorona stories created some of the most psychologically complex versions of the legend. Catholic concepts of sin, punishment, and redemption provided a framework for understanding why La Llorona was condemned to eternal suffering, but they also suggested the possibility that her punishment might eventually end if she could find some form of spiritual resolution. This tension between eternal damnation and possible redemption gave the stories an emotional depth that earlier versions had lacked. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as Colombian society grappled with questions of national identity and modernization, La Llorona stories began incorporating themes about the conflict between traditional values and modern life. The weeping woman became a symbol of what was being lost as communities abandoned old ways of living in favor of new economic and social arrangements. Her eternal grief represented not just individual loss but collective mourning for disappearing ways of life. The most recent evolution of La Llorona stories reflects contemporary concerns about urbanization, environmental destruction, and family stability. Modern versions often emphasize her role as a protector of natural spaces, appearing to warn people about the consequences of polluting rivers or destroying wetlands. Her weeping becomes a lament not just for lost children but for a lost relationship between human communities and the natural world that sustains them. Archaeological evidence of water cult sites. Recent archaeological discoveries throughout Colombia have revealed extensive evidence of pre-Columbian ceremonial sites specifically designed for water-related spiritual practices. These findings provide important context for understanding how indigenous beliefs about water spirits may have influenced the development of legends like La Llorona, and they suggest that certain locations associated with the weeping woman may have been considered sacred for many centuries before Spanish colonization. Excavations at sites along the Magdalena River have uncovered elaborate stone platforms positioned at specific points where tributaries join the main river flow. These platforms show evidence of having been used for ceremonies involving offerings thrown into the water. Pottery fragments, gold ornaments, and carved figurines have been recovered from the river sediments nearby. Radiocarbon dating indicates that some of these sites were in continuous use for over 500 years before the Spanish arrival. The positioning of these ceremonial sites is particularly significant. They are almost invariably located at places where the acoustic properties of flowing water create sounds that resemble human voices or crying. Indigenous engineers appear to have identified these natural amphitheaters and enhanced them with stone construction that amplified and focused the water sounds. The result would have been locations where the boundary between natural and supernatural seemed particularly thin. Petroglyphs found near many of these water cult sites depict female figures with flowing hair that blends into stylized representations of river currents. Some of these images show women holding children, while others show women with empty arms raised in gestures of lamentation. The artistic style and weathering patterns suggest these petroglyphs were created over many centuries by different cultural groups, indicating that water-based feminine spiritual figures were important across multiple pre-Columbian societies. Perhaps most intriguingly, several of these archaeological sites correspond to locations that appear prominently in modern La Llorona stories. The sacred pool at Nemocon, where pre-Columbian peoples conducted water ceremonies for over 300 years, is still identified by local residents as a place where La Llorona appears regularly. The continuity of spiritual significance across such a long time period suggests that certain locations may possess qualities that consistently inspire similar types of supernatural experiences and cultural interpretations. Ceramic fragments recovered from these sites often bear images that seem to prefigure later La Llorona iconography. Vessels decorated with weeping women, flowing water, and childlike figures suggest that the themes central to the La Llorona legend were already established in indigenous artistic traditions centuries before Spanish colonization. This archaeological evidence supports the theory that the legend represents a synthesis of pre-Columbian beliefs with colonial-era historical experiences, rather than a purely European or purely indigenous creation. Colonial guilt and the birth of ghost stories. The emergence of La Llorona as a dominant figure in Colombian folklore cannot be separated from the profound social tensions and moral contradictions that characterized colonial society. While indigenous and mixed-race communities living near rivers developed intimate, practical relationships with the legend, the Spanish colonial elite initially encountered these stories as curious examples of local superstition, yet gradually found themselves drawn into a complex psychological relationship with the weeping woman that reflected their own hidden anxieties about the society they had created. In the grand houses of colonial Bogotá and Cartagena, where thick walls and elaborate courtyards provided insulation from the sounds and concerns of the street, La Llorona stories initially circulated primarily through the whispered conversations of domestic servants. Indigenous and African women who worked as cooks, laundresses, and nursemaids brought these tales from their own communities, sharing them during the long evening hours when their employers had retired and the great houses settled into darkness. The Spanish colonial elite lived in a world of carefully maintained appearances, where social hierarchy was rigidly enforced and moral behavior was expected to conform to strict Catholic standards. Yet this surface propriety concealed a reality of widespread sexual exploitation, abandoned children, and broken families created by the very structures of colonial power that the elite depended upon for their wealth and status. Spanish men routinely maintained indigenous or mixed-race mistresses alongside their legitimate wives, creating parallel families that existed in legal and social limbo. When colonial gentlemen first heard La Llorona stories from their servants, many dismissed them as primitive superstitions unworthy of educated consideration. Yet these same men often found themselves thinking about the stories at unexpected moments, when walking past certain rivers, when hearing unexplained sounds at night, when confronted with evidence of their own moral compromises. The figure of the eternally punished mother began to represent not just individual tragedy but collective guilt about a social system that systematically destroyed families and communities. The psychological power of the La Llorona legend for colonial elites lay in its ability to give form to anxieties that their social position prevented them from acknowledging directly. The weeping woman became a repository for guilt about abandoned mistresses, illegitimate children left to survive without support, and indigenous families broken apart by economic exploitation. Her eternal punishment reflected their own fears about divine judgment for participation in a fundamentally unjust system. As generations passed and colonial families established deeper roots in Colombian soil, the boundary between elite and popular culture became increasingly permeable. Children of Spanish colonists grew up hearing La Llorona stories from their indigenous and African caregivers, absorbing these narratives during their most impressionable years. When these children reached adulthood, they carried with them a complex mixture of official Catholic teachings and folk beliefs that would shape their understanding of morality, family, and social responsibility throughout their lives. The Salon Society's secret fascination. By the late colonial period and early years of independence, Colombian high society had developed elaborate social rituals centered around literary salons, musical gatherings, and intellectual discussions. These events, typically hosted in the elegant homes of wealthy families, provided opportunities for the educated elite to display their refinement and engage with European cultural trends. Yet even in these rarefied settings, La Llorona stories found their way into polite conversation, often disguised as ethnographic curiosities or examples of local folklore worthy of scholarly attention. Dona Manuela Sainz, the aristocratic woman who would later become Simon Bolívar's companion, was known to entertain guests at her Bogotá salon with dramatic recitations of La Llorona stories that she had collected from servants and rural visitors. She possessed a gift for storytelling that could transform these folk tales into sophisticated entertainment, adding psychological complexity and poetic language that appealed to educated audiences while preserving the essential emotional core of the original narratives. These salon performances served multiple functions within elite social circles. On the surface, they demonstrated the sophisticated cultural interests of the hosts and their ability to appreciate the artistic merit of indigenous traditions. More subtly, they provided a socially acceptable way for the elite to explore themes of passion, transgression, and punishment that their public moral codes prevented them from discussing directly. The women of colonial high society found themselves particularly drawn to La Llorona stories, perhaps because they recognized in the weeping woman's fate their own vulnerability within a social system that offered them few legal protections and limited personal autonomy. Wealthy women were expected to maintain perfect reputations while navigating a social world where their husband's behavior could expose them to scandal and disgrace at any moment. The legend provided a framework for thinking about female suffering that acknowledged its reality while placing it safely in the realm of supernatural rather than social critique. Young men from elite families often found themselves oddly fascinated by La Llorona stories, especially versions that emphasized the tragic beauty of the weeping woman and the passionate love that had led to her downfall. These narratives allowed them to explore romantic themes that their restrictive social environment otherwise discouraged, while also serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of uncontrolled desire and the importance of maintaining appropriate social boundaries. The influence of salon discussions on the evolution of La Llorona stories was considerable. Elite storytellers added literary sophistication to the basic narrative, incorporating elements from European Gothic literature and Romantic poetry that gave the legend new emotional depth and complexity. These embellished versions then filtered back into popular culture, where they influenced how ordinary people understood and retold the traditional stories. Aristocratic women and hidden tragedies. The private letters and diaries of colonial Colombian aristocratic women, many of which have been preserved in family archives and historical collections, reveal a hidden world of personal tragedy that bears striking resemblances to the La Llorona legend. These documents, never intended for public view, provide insight into how the experiences of elite women may have both shaped and been shaped by the evolving folklore surrounding the weeping woman. Esperanza Marquez de Villarreal, the wife of a wealthy hacienda owner in the Cauca Valley, left behind a diary covering the years 1785 to 1803 that documents her struggle with repeated miscarriages and infant deaths. Her entries reveal a woman consumed by grief and self-blame, convinced that her losses were divine punishment for unnamed sins. She writes of walking alone by the river that bordered their estate, weeping for the children she could never hold, and sometimes imagining that she heard other women's voices joining her lamentations. The correspondence of Isabella Ramirez de Santander, a member of one of Bogotá's most prominent families, includes several letters to her sister describing her anguish over her husband's public affair with an indigenous woman and the children born from that relationship. Isabella's letters reveal her torn feelings about these half-siblings to her own children, compassion for their difficult circumstances mixed with rage at their existence as living reminders of her humiliation. She writes of sometimes feeling haunted by the thought of their unknown mother and wondering whether her own privileged children were somehow cursed by the suffering their father had caused. Perhaps most poignantly, the papers of Maria Antonia Bolívar, Simon Bolívar's sister, include several references to dreams and visions of a weeping woman who appeared to warn her about dangers facing her family during the independence wars. These supernatural encounters seem to have provided her with a way to process the enormous losses her family suffered during that violent period, the deaths of parents, siblings, and eventually her famous brother himself. These private documents suggest that aristocratic women were not simply consumers of La Llorona stories told by their servants but active participants in the legend's evolution. Their own experiences of loss, guilt, and powerlessness within the constraints of colonial society may have influenced how they understood and retold these traditional narratives. The psychological themes that appear in their private writings, maternal grief, punishment for transgression, the blurring of boundaries between the living and the dead, are precisely the elements that give the La Llorona legend its enduring emotional power. The fact that these elite women often experience their encounters with the supernatural near rivers and streams on their own properties suggests that the geographical aspects of the legend were as important for the wealthy as for the poor. Water features served as liminal spaces where the rigid social boundaries that normally constrained aristocratic women could be temporarily suspended, allowing them to express emotions and acknowledge experiences that their public roles required them to suppress. Economic pressures and abandoned children. The economic structures of colonial Colombian society created systematic conditions that made the abandonment of children a recurring social problem, particularly affecting relationships between social classes. Understanding these economic pressures provides crucial context for comprehending why the La Llorona legend resonated so powerfully across different levels of society and why it continued to evolve as economic conditions changed over time. Spanish colonial law and Catholic Church doctrine created a complex system of inheritance and legitimacy that had profound consequences for children born outside of sanctioned marriages. Legitimate children of Spanish parents could inherit property and social position, while illegitimate children, particularly those with indigenous or African ancestry, had few legal rights and limited opportunities for social advancement. This system created powerful incentives for wealthy men to abandon the children they fathered with women of lower social status. The economic pressures facing women in colonial society were particularly severe. Indigenous and mixed-race women had limited opportunities for independent economic survival, making relationships with wealthy Spanish men one of the few paths to material security. However, these relationships offered no guarantees of long-term support, and women who bore children from such unions often found themselves facing impossible choices when their protectors lost interest or were pressured by their families to end the relationships. Convents and charitable institutions in major cities like Bogotá and Cartagena developed systems for receiving abandoned infants, but these institutions were chronically underfunded and could provide only minimal care. Records from the Convento de la Enseñanza in Bogotá show that during the 1760s and 1770s, they received an average of 3 abandoned infants per week, most of whom died within their first year due to inadequate nutrition and medical care. The psychological burden of this systematic child abandonment fell particularly heavily on the women who were forced to make these terrible decisions. Unlike the men who could simply walk away from their responsibilities, women carried the physical and emotional consequences of pregnancy and birth, making the decision to abandon a child an intensely traumatic experience that could haunt them for the rest of their lives. La Llorona stories provided a cultural framework for understanding and processing this widespread social tragedy. The legend's emphasis on eternal punishment for child abandonment served multiple functions. It expressed moral condemnation of the practice while also acknowledging the desperate circumstances that could drive women to such extremes. The supernatural elements of the story allowed communities to discuss these painful realities without directly confronting the powerful individuals and social structures that created them. As Colombian society evolved through independence and into the Republican period, economic pressures continued to create conditions that separated families and endangered children. The legend adapted to reflect new circumstances. Versions from the late 19th century often emphasized economic necessity as a factor in La Llorona's tragedy, while 20th century tellings began incorporating themes about migration and urbanization that reflected contemporary social challenges. The Church's complex relationship with folk belief. The Catholic Church's response to the La Llorona legend reveals the complex negotiations that characterized the relationship between official religious doctrine and popular spiritual practices throughout Colombian history. Rather than simply condemning the stories as pagan superstition, Church authorities gradually developed a more sophisticated approach that attempted to harness the legend's emotional power while redirecting it toward Orthodox Catholic teachings. In the early colonial period, parish priests often found themselves caught between their duty to suppress indigenous spiritual practices and the practical reality that these beliefs provided important social functions within their communities. La Llorona stories helped parents teach children about water safety, reinforced social norms about family responsibility, and provided psychological outlets for processing grief and trauma. Completely eliminating such useful narratives would have created social problems without offering adequate replacements. Forward-thinking clergymen began experimenting with ways to incorporate La Llorona themes into their sermons and religious instruction, emphasizing elements of the legend that aligned with Catholic moral teachings while downplaying aspects that suggested non-Christian spiritual beliefs. The story of a woman eternally punished for her sins provided an excellent framework for discussing concepts like divine justice, the consequences of moral transgression, and the importance of living according to church teachings. Father Antonio Julian, a Jesuit missionary who worked throughout the Magdalena River Valley in the 1750s, wrote extensively about his efforts to Christianize local folk beliefs rather than eliminate them entirely. His letters to religious superiors describe how he would begin his sermons by acknowledging that his parishioners had heard stories about the weeping woman by the river, then used these familiar narratives as starting points for discussions about Christian concepts of sin, redemption, and divine mercy. This approach proved remarkably successful in creating versions of the La Llorona legend that satisfied both popular spiritual needs and official religious requirements. Church-influenced tellings emphasized the possibility of redemption through prayer and penance, suggested that the weeping woman's suffering could be alleviated through the intervention of saints, and connected her story to biblical narratives about maternal loss and divine punishment. However, the Church's engagement with La Llorona stories also had unintended consequences that complicated its relationship with the legend. By providing official recognition and theological interpretation for the stories, religious authorities inadvertently strengthened their credibility and ensured their survival through changing social conditions. The legend became more rather than less influential as a result of church attention, taking on new layers of meaning that made it relevant to broader segments of Colombian society. As we reach the end of our long journey through the misty valleys of Colombian folklore, let yourself settle more deeply into the present moment, where electric lights keep the darkness at bay and running water flows safely from taps rather than wild rivers. The Colombia we have explored tonight, with its colonial anxieties, its indigenous water spirits, and its communities bound together by shared fear and shared stories, feels both distant and strangely familiar. The legend of La Llorona endures not because it offers simple answers or easy comfort, but because it provides a vessel large enough to hold the full complexity of human experience. In her eternal weeping, we hear echoes of every mother's fear, every society's guilt, every community's need to make sense of loss and find meaning in suffering. She bridges the gap between the rational and the mystical, between history and myth, between the individual tragedy and the collective memory that shapes us all. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might listen for the sound of water, perhaps rain against your windows, perhaps the distant hum of pipes within your walls. These are gentle sounds, domestic sounds, far removed from the wild rivers where our story began. Yet in their rhythm, you might catch an echo of something older, something that connects your safe, modern bedroom to the endless flow of human stories that have come before and will continue long after we are gone. Rest now in the knowledge that some stories are too important to die, too necessary to forget. Like water itself, they find ways to persist, to adapt, to continue flowing through the landscape of human consciousness, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of all the generations who have paused beside rivers in the darkness, listening for voices that might or might not be there. The weeping woman of Colombia continues her eternal walk along the riverbanks of memory, but tonight, you are safely distant from her sorrow, wrapped in the comfort of the present moment and the promise of peaceful sleep. Let her story fade now into the background of your consciousness, becoming part of the gentle current that carries you toward rest.